I'm often asked why I left the priesthood. And I didn't, strictly speaking, I didn't leave the priesthood as such. I left the church. Unlike colleagues of mine and other people who leave the priesthood but remain members of the church, that wasn't true in my case.
All the Christian churches in Ireland have a reputation for fundamentalism and dogmatism. Their influence is widespread, from education to legislation.
I had, educated myself politically to see a broader view. But when it came down to it in this country, when the shit hit the fan, I was just going to go out there and I was just going to be counted with the prods.
There is an epigram of Brendan Behan's, which I'm bound to remember wrongly, but the gist of which was that the Protestant was a Catholic with a horse. The implication being that really the essential distinction was one of class or of property ownership.
The political conflict in the north of Ireland is often described as a religious war, yet the labels Protestant and Catholic merely coincide with the terms unionist and nationalist.
He was probably killed by people that were similar to him, in that sense. They were more than likely from the Ballysullen area, not far from him, similar area, same levels of unemployment and all the rest, and probably by somebody very similar to himself but from a Protestant background.
The churches teach that Christianity is about tolerance, peace and love. But Christianity can also be about control, violence and fear.
I've always found that the Christian imagery was very anti-human, really, very cruel. I mean, the figure of the Christ on the cross, bleeding and suffering and wounded and violated. It's a very cruel image, and I think that, and similarly the awful cold impossibility of the Blessed Blue Virgin.
Opposition to the influences of the churches is rarely given coverage, yet there has always been an underlying trend of criticism. Atheists provide the clearest response.
He's able to transform you. He's able to make you a brand new person. That's what he came in. The Bible says he was manifested to destroy the work of the devil. When Jesus Christ himself is coming back again.
When I went to secondary school, which was in fact called Londonderry High School for Young Ladies in Derry in 1968, I became more aware because I was coming outside of my little Protestant area and across the Catholic city, and of course an awful lot was starting to happen by 1968. It was at that school that I became aware really of the viciousness of sectarianism. My parents were anti-sectarian and had brought us up to see what sectarianism had done. You know, my mother would point out to us the housing estates away up in the mountains, which was where Catholics had been put to live as part of gerrymandering. So it did come as quite a shock in secondary school when there was a pretense of normality kept up, but at the same time the thing would erupt during religion classes or Irish history classes, when I can remember girls saying things like, sure, they're breeding like rats up there in the Creggan, and you know, I don't know what they're talking about police brutality for. They started it with their marches and so on.
In Belfast in 1987, Frank McCallum's brother was shot dead by a loyalist paramilitary group.
Well, Callum was killed in the early hours of the morning by 3 or 4 gunmen who had been in the estate that he lived in for a number of hours. They had tried to get 2 other people earlier, Now, it was described as a random, meaningless sectarian assassination. He fought with him for a while. He ran. He was eventually brought down from about 30 yards, and then was 3 more shots put in his head from close range. Now, the thing about the randomness is, that's the essential part of it. The randomness is what is supposed to cause fear. That you can drive into the sort of estate that he lived in, which was quite large. You can go right to the very back of it. You can hang around for a couple of hours, have a go at a couple of people, eventually get one person who you know nothing about, and you just shoot them.
I was living in Suffolk. The problem was that I was a single parent at the time, so I had a 3-year-old daughter. Across the street I had my mother, who was living alone. So in a way, in an ultimate situation, I was kind of responsible for both of those. And Suffolk is an isolated Protestant enclave. And at the time of the hunger strike, of course, it was one of those real blow-up crisis points. It's going to go to civil war, etc. And Suffolk, if it should go to civil war, will be the first place that the loyalist community will try and hold. It's kind of a microcosm, as they see it, of the siege that they're under. I had to face the possibility that I couldn't get out. I could get out myself, but I had responsibilities. And I thought, well, what will happen if the area is attacked? And I thought, well, I will take nothing to do with it because I do not agree with paramilitaries. But then I thought, but if my house is attacked, do I defend my house, or do I defend the street, or do I defend the estate? And it occurred to me just that when it came down to it, yes, I was going to fight to protect my own. And because I was from a Protestant background, I lived in a Protestant area, that I would be out there fighting alongside people who I have no political sympathy for whatsoever. And it kind of made a mockery of my entire political life up to that point. I can remember sitting in the house crying because I just didn't want this. I had, educated myself politically to see a broader view. But when it came down to it in this country, when the shit hit the fan, I was just going to go out there and I was just going to be counted with the prods.
The desire for change, for the giving up of privilege, competes with the fear of being overrun, of being swamped. The contradictions which accompany such challenges are not easily overcome.
If you're born into a Catholic or a Protestant family and you become an atheist, you're asked, well, yeah, okay, so you're an atheist, but are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? And while I believe that that's wrong in some ways, there is a certain amount of truth in it, because if you're born into a privileged section of society, you do inherit some of that privilege, and you're coloured by that. If you're born a Protestant in a society which favours Protestants, you do gain advantage by that. I think there's a lot of similarities between sectarianism and sexism. If you're born a man into a male-dominated society, you do inherit privilege, and in both cases, I think that it's not just enough to say, as a Protestant, sectarianism, I'm not sectarian, I'm against sectarianism, I think Catholics are fine. And for men who say, well, I've nothing against women, you have to actually actively challenge your sectarianism or your sexism as it's inherent in yourself.
Being brought up in a Protestant community, I think I got some insight into how Protestants saw Catholics, and it went very much along the lines of Catholics being lesser beings in some way, and if you scratch that, deeper, that idea deeper. It went to the degree that they were not able to run the country, and that there was a lot of fear about Catholics essentially having any opportunity to run the country. A, they were, first of all, they'd make a hash of it, and B, they would bring along the influence of the Catholic Church, which was to be feared enormously. And as a result of that, I think the Protestant stroke unionists have alienated themselves to a large degree, and they are now unable to consider the idea of power sharing. And really over the last few years, I suppose particularly since the Anglo-Irish Agreement, they're isolating themselves more and more.
Discrimination wasn't an accident. It wasn't just something that happened. Discrimination was fostered in the early days of the Northern Ireland state. Working class Protestants, I believe, were led to believe that they were getting some sort of a better deal, though it wasn't that much better. But that led to the building up of sectarian workforces, particularly in the harder and more profitable industrial sectors like heavy engineering and shipbuilding. And that's still with us today. And the whole notion now of fair employment within those areas is very much on the political agenda.
Discrimination on the basis of religion has a long history in the society and government of Northern Ireland. Basil Brooke, later to become Prime Minister, revealed the extent to which sectarianism was part of the structure of society, when in 1933 he proclaimed, "There are a great number of Protestants who employ Roman Catholics. I feel I can speak freely on this subject, as I have not a Roman Catholic about the house." This sectarian pattern which had emerged affected most aspects of life, particularly the right to vote, housing and jobs. Today, Catholics are 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed than Protestants.
The trade union response to that has been in some ways very muted. I was told of examples last year where, outside of Catholics being singled out, Protestant shop stewards who defended fair employment had dead rats left in their lockers in the shipyard. Up until last year, at particular times of the year, the place was obviously bedecked out in loyalist regalia and so on. It's not a happy environment for a person who's in a minority, who feels cautious about going into a workplace with a sectarian record of abuse and violence. It's not a place that they would want to work in.
The two largest manufacturing industries in Northern Ireland, Harland and Wolff the shipyard and Shorts the aircraft builders, employ respectively 95% and 90% Protestants.
I think the employers formerly didn't want to deal with it. Now they do, and they don't know how to do it because employment levels are in decline, particularly in the industrial sector. And it is a matter that only, in my opinion, only the unions can solve. And they can only solve it by taking it on the shop floor. And that does mean being courageous, but it does mean taking up that political question of discrimination, of fair employment, and of sectarianism.
This discrimination was institutionalized by partition. The state created in the south has its majority and minority also, yet its minority, the Protestant community, were in the main landowners, industrialists and managers.
The Protestant minority played a very passive role as a minority in the early years of the state. It played no role that I can discern as a critical minority, as a dissident minority in the whole process of the drafting of the Constitution of the Republic. Despite what is now said about the sectarian nature of the Constitution, the Protestant bishops were consulted, as were the Catholic bishops, and as far as I'm aware, they raised no great objections, for instance, to the constitutional ban on divorce.
Foreigners perceive Ireland as being somewhat backward. They're often shocked when you mention things like contraception or abortion or divorce, so they're immediately shock horror. And obviously there's the perception of the war in the north as being a religious war. But I mean, I don't think you can say that without looking at the context in which these things happen, and also how those terms are actually abused anyway in the first place. I think Ireland is a country that was colonised by Britain, and part of that colonisation, in the process of colonisation, religion was actually made an issue in the sense that people were persecuted because they were Catholic.
During the penal laws of the 18th century, all political power was removed from Catholics, and their rights to practice their religion severely curtailed. The British government had also inserted into the laws a clause which discriminated against Protestant dissenters, who were mainly Presbyterian. Under the penal laws, Catholics could not own land or lease it on a long-term basis. They were not allowed to be educated at home or abroad. They were debarred from all professions except for medicine. They were not allowed to bear arms. The vote was removed from freeholders. If Catholics were to convert to Protestantism, all their rights would be returned. The Protestant Reformation in England had given colonisation a religious zeal, but the main criterion for persecution was opposition to British rule, and not just whether one was Catholic or Protestant or even atheist.
Catholic priests, and at different stages the bishops, were actually involved in campaigning for rights of Catholics. So, for example, around the issue of Catholic emancipation, the bishops wholeheartedly supported the idea and were involved with O'Connell and the Catholic middle class in a process of mobilising the masses of Irish people. And a lot of that was done through the networks of the church and the priests and so on. So in that sense, there was a Catholic response to colonisation, and the fact that religion was persecuted gave the church almost a special place, or the religion a special place, in the fight against British imperialism in this country.
Independence from Britain was by this stage almost exclusively a Catholic concern. The earlier United Irishmen Rebellion of 1798, inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, had been led mainly by Presbyterians. However, their common cause with the Catholic dispossessed foundered in the period of reaction following the defeat of that rebellion. Yet there has always been an element of Protestant involvement in Irish nationalism.
The Protestant community has also, even in the life of the state, as well as in the years leading up to the formation of the state, been disproportionately represented in quite a number of intellectually progressive activities, in the Gaelic League, in Irish language activities, which might seem surprising at first instance, and certainly was a major point of distinction between the Protestants of the south, of what became the Republic, and the Protestants of the north. They were strongly represented in the nationalist movement, both in its cultural and in its political manifestations. And my father certainly represented the continuation of that. He had been brought up in probably a pro-unionist or mildly pro-unionist kind of atmosphere, but opted to study the Irish language after his studies in England. Now, that minority within the minority was always small, but I think greatly to be respected. And maybe it was just that relatively small group of people identified with liberalism and so on, who held the line, as it were, against the totalitarian cultural triumphalism of Catholic nationalism.
There were also clashes between the nationalist tradition and the Catholic Church, in particular the Republican movements from the United Irishmen to the present-day Sinn Féin, proclaim in their manifestos an opposition to sectarianism. This, however, has never led to a more secular ideology or practice.
There was never, as part of that movement, a strong anti-clerical tradition, which if you look at republicanism, say in America, or especially in France where it originated, anti-clericalism was a very central tenet on the separation of church and state. And that didn't happen in Ireland, because I think the Republicans understood that the church was an important force in mobilising people, and secondly, if people went too strong on the church, they could isolate themselves from the masses of people who they were actually dependent on to achieve independence. So I think what happened was this emergence of a very Catholic Irish nationalist identity.
The identities of being Catholic and Irish in the southern state, or Protestant and British in the northern state, are reinforced in the institutions of everyday life, such as schools, youth groups, and community organisations. The important rituals in life and death, from christening to burial, provide crucial opportunities for church influence over even the most lapsed of Christians. The Catholic and Protestant churches take their responsibility as shepherds of flocks very seriously.
It is maintained by many in West Belfast, and I be inclined to agree that there was some sort of deal was done between the Northern Ireland office in '82 and leading figures in the Catholic Church about putting money into West Belfast, how that would be controlled to keep it away from paramilitaries, and also to keep it away from those who would be suspect in the eyes of both the NIO and the Church. And I think that now this last 5 years has proved that, because of the number of schemes being operated, the ACE scheme, the Community Employment Scheme, as it would be in England, the ACE scheme, to all intents and purposes in West Belfast, is completely controlled by the Catholic Church. Either priests are the managers of the schemes, or they're the chairman of the boards that run it. There are church nominees throughout those boards. By and large, they're anti-trade union. They're replacing trade union jobs in the public sector, quite consciously and deliberately. They don't appear to have any difficulty getting their schemes extended, while more community-based schemes that don't have those influences get chopped, are getting cut, and are generally going to the wall for lack of money and funding. I think there's a common view that the Church, in its finest traditions, has done the deal with the government and ensured its own control over its patch, and that the government is content with that because it's the lesser of two evils.
The Catholic Church's intervention in the economy depends on whether it is the government's money or its own that is being called upon. Strabane is a mainly Catholic town and has one of the region's highest rates of unemployment, 50% of the adult male population. Paddy Logue, who once worked there as a priest, describes a different response to economic deprivation.
The old church was pretty old and inadequate for the parish, as was the parochial house. So the proposal was that a new church and 2 new parochial houses be built with a copper roof on the church, and indeed a copper roof on each of the 2 houses. One of these houses would house the parish priest, and the other one the 2 curates. I can't remember the exact figure at that time, but it was a sizable chunk of money, certainly £250,000. And we're talking about the 60s now, which that was a considerable sum of money. Myself and a group of lay people got together with an alternative plan. Using the same sum of money, we suggested that a considerable community resource could be built on the same site. This could be used for worship and other religious practices, but it could also be used for youth and community activities. As well as that, there would have been money left over to build a number of homes, small homes for pensioners. The clergy could have occupied one of these homes as well, and workshops for the young unemployed. Strabane, as a lot of people know, heads the European League table for unemployment, and there was quite a number of old people in Strabane also. It wasn't just a young town, there was a lot of old people there, and homes for the elderly was a problem. So this suggestion, when we put to the parish priest, and the parish priest was a very gentlemanly and prayerful person, kind man, It was incomprehensible to him that anybody, Catholic people, or even certainly a priest, to come up with a harebrained idea like this. I think if I'd gone into him and hit him on the head with a mallet, it wouldn't have come to him as a bigger shock. And of course it was completely rejected, this plan.
The Catholic Church's influence in the southern state, where over 90% of the population is regarded as Catholic, is highlighted in the quote of Eamon de Valera, later to become president, who said in 1930, "If I had a vote on a local body and there were two qualified people who had to deal with a Catholic community, and if one were Catholic and the other Protestant, I would unhesitatingly vote for the Catholic." In 1986, Susan McKay went from the north to work on a youth project in the west of Ireland.
When I left Belfast and went to live in Sligo, I felt a great sense of liberation, you know, that I was getting away from militarism and violence and sectarianism. But I wasn't very long in my job as a director of a youth centre in Sligo before just before I started that job, I had read The Trial by Franz Kafka, and I was only in the job a very short time when I began to exhibit all the symptoms of the person in the book who is constantly fatigued and sick and weighed down, and it was really uncannily similar what happened. In the book, Kay is arrested, but he's never told what crime he is accused of committing. He then starts to find courtrooms everywhere and punishments being enacted, and he becomes weak and sick. My meetings with the management committee were like inquisitions. The project was paying £10,000 or more a year in rent to the bishop for a building which only cost £40,000. I challenged this. I also wanted the young unemployed people to have a say in the running of the centre. Management refused this completely. However, the centre was running very well. Then they dismissed me. They gave no reasons for this, and it took my union nearly a year to drag them to a rights commissioner. When the hearing came up, my name was cleared. I was reinstated and compensated and resigned. And what was the high irony of the whole thing was that the person who initiated this whole sort of inquisition against me was a sister of mercy.
From the ages of about 4 to 12, I was sent to Girls' Brigade, which is part of the Presbyterian Church. It's a club for girls to go to. There's also a Boys' Brigade. And it again was very controlling. It controlled my religious education. There was a lot of marching in it, a lot of exercises in it, and a lot of biblical teaching in it. Our subjects were not discussed, which would have been relevant to me as a young woman, such as parental problems, living at home, growing up, sex education.
The role of the church in a town like Sligo was very similar. It was just everywhere. Every organisation had nuns or priests in its hierarchy. Every youth club had a saint's name. You know, they just were everywhere. They saturate society. And I found it very stifling, and I think the young people find it very stifling, and they're very frustrated by it. But I think the church deliberately maintains that huge claustrophobic presence in young people's lives, because they don't want people to have the mental space to look around and see society with their own eyes, you know.
The Protestant churches in the south also exercise their social control through the education system and community custom. In Drogheda, a predominantly Catholic town on the east coast, the minority Anglican Church of Ireland tends its flock on the principle of a community that stays together, prays together.
We were brought up in a small community within Drogheda, a Protestant community within Drogheda, which was defined by its allegiance to the Church of Ireland, although the other Protestant churches were also represented and we had some contact with them, which is defined also geographically, as it happened, by being a small enclave in the middle of the town. The house that our family lived in was in fact formerly used as a boarding school and was owned by a Church of Ireland related trust. The houses immediately in front of us were also owned by a Church of Ireland body and were occupied, all of them, by Protestant families. Directly in front of our house was the graveyard and the church, the Protestant church, in a fairly dominant position in the town. That's geographic, and then socially and culturally, the community reinforced itself with tennis clubs that were, if not exclusively Protestant, certainly predominantly Protestant. Girl Guides and Boys Brigade, YMCA, all of that was actually, as it happens, within easy reach of this little enclave within the town. And of course, we went to a Protestant Church of Ireland run national school. So we had a clear sense of our distinctiveness and of our difference from the majority population.
There was a particular Saturday some months ago whenever I went up to Lisburn to do my shopping. I live in Lisburn, and as I walked into the town, the entire centre of the town had been taken over by a group of English missionaries here who were coming to spread their gospel. And this leaflet was handed into my hand, "The Devil and Rock Music, all youth groups welcome." And they were going to answer all your questions about how it inspires you towards drugs, sex, and violence and stuff like this. One of the answers they were going to give you was the true meaning of the term rock and roll. Do you know what the true meaning of the term rock and roll is? Sex.
One issue more than any other binds the churches together, despite their cultural differences in their declared struggle against materialism and atheism. That is the issue of sexuality. Homosexuality, for example, has until recently been totally criminalised in both states. The British 1967 Act, limited to consenting male adults over 21 and in private, was eventually extended to the North in 1983 after an individual case was taken to the European Court. And in 1988, the South's legislation, a relic of the British presence, was discredited when one of its own citizens brought the government to the European Court. The acknowledgement of lesbianism is avoided by not even legislating against it. Whether it is the Save Ulster from Sodomy campaign supported by the Free Presbyterian Church in the North, or the Love is for Life campaign against divorce, backed by the Catholic Church in the South, sexuality appears to be the bed where all churches feel safe to lie together.
I think when growing up female, you get a lot of mixed messages around your sexuality from the church and the family and the educational system. You're being told to be passive and to be pretty and to have high sexual morals, which is not losing your virginity in effect. And on the other hand, I think primarily through the media you're getting messages as a female to be a sexual object.
Whether it is the media's sexually available model or the church's pure mother, women's role is based on restriction and control. The exercise of such control is also evident in the attitude of both states to abortion. Ireland, North and South, remains the only country in Europe, along with Greece, which outlaws abortion. Last year, about 2,000 women from the North and 4,000 from the South travelled to England to have abortions. In the South, the 1983 referendum, to enshrine the outlawing of abortion within the Constitution, released many oppositional forces.
I think that the Christian religions can accommodate a great deal of violence as well. This really came home to me a few years ago during the first, what became known as the abortion amendment to the Irish Constitution. I was living in Belfast at the time, and a group of feminists from Belfast decided to go down and help the anti-amendment campaign in the South by leafleting in Donegal. And we really were received in a very hostile and aggressive way in a lot of the towns that we went to.
It's the guilt, the criminalisation, the whole stuff that the churches, particularly the Catholic Church, lays on people. So clearly, if in the Catholic Church's view, abortion is murder, the next logical step is that the person who carries out an abortion is a murderer.
In one town that we were in, a woman came up to us and said, "You should all be shot." This was a pro-life supporter. And a boy who was only about 12 or 13 came up to us and said, "You should all be put up against a wall and screwed and screwed and screwed and made to have babies," you know? Really, really aggressive.
Before I had my own abortion, as I said, I was pro-choice. And I had tended to kind of rationalise the whole thing in terms of, you know, this thing of when does life begin and get into all these kind of arguments. But once I became pregnant myself and chose the decision, I knew there was no doubt in my mind that, you know, there was a life there. And I still have no doubt in my mind. Intellectually, I think I probably tried to deny that. But in the therapy, I mean, what I actually did was, if you like, talk to this baby, or what might have been a baby. Spoke out loud, if you like, the reasons why I felt I had to take the decision I had. And, if you like, symbolically let go.
In another town that we went into, a woman said to us, "You should all go back over the border," which I think is interesting, you know, because I think in a lot of ways Southerners identify all Northerners in that way, that we are a corrupt place which is seeping out violent and anti-religious ideas.
Last year, Niagara decided to organise an international tribunal on abortion. We choose October, which is the anniversary of the 67 Act, and it meant that Northern Ireland was 20 years without the same legislation.
Evidence heard by the tribunal confirmed that Northern Irish women suffer enormous emotional and psychological distress and unacceptable financial burdens as a result of the lack of abortion provision in Northern Ireland. They are prey to isolation, condemnation, fear and loneliness, often in excess of women elsewhere in the UK, owing to the social, cultural and religious complexity of their society.
Obviously, we never talked about sex, and sex was never came up within the school as such, in a manner that was going to deal with it and explain it and talk about the emotions involved, you know, in a way that would actually educate us and help us as we got older. We obviously learned about sex from the streets, in a sense that we all knew little bits and it was all pulled together. And I think because our level of knowledge was so low, I don't think we really knew the right questions to ask. I mean, for example, I didn't know for years that people could masturbate each other, for example, as an alternative, or that women even had orgasms. I mean, that was a complete revelation to me, you know. Like, I went through my whole teenage years totally unaware of this fact. And I think it was only around 17 or 18 that we really began to have any sense of how things were actually, how our bodies worked, you know, just physically.
There was a traditional view that contraception is wrong, always and in every circumstance. And there was the other view that contraception was a matter of personal choice for the couple. And the latter view was the one I espoused and practiced in confessions and also preaching about it. This led to a number of problems with the bishop. Bishop Farron was the bishop at that time. Verbal communication was not easy with the bishop. In fact, we exchanged correspondence about it. And he instructed me that the traditional view was the only view in the church and must be adhered to. And if I were not prepared to preach that line, then I should not preach about contraception. This went on for a while, and from the confessional, it was clear that this issue of contraception was very big and very painful for a lot of Catholic couples.
There was never any sense of discussing relationships, emotions, feelings. It just wasn't on the agenda. And I think that does leave you scarred. I think Irish men, in particular, are totally incapable of discussing, of being open, for example, feeling able to discuss their emotions with other men. I think a lot of them do it with women, especially their partners. But there's a complete inability, I think, to talk about issues of feelings, sex, in the company of other men, you know. But in a way that obviously they can do it in a way which is joking and macho and, you know, did you get it last night sort of thing, but not in a way which is helpful to them, which actually allows them to be open, discuss any problems they may have, or even just to gain some more knowledge or insights into how they may be actually feeling.
I was going on holidays in the summer, and I was going to Paris to a friend of mine who was also a priest. He was studying there at that time. So on the Sunday before I went, I thought, bugger it. Well, I know this is an issue, and I'll preach again, and I'll say there are two views in the church, which I did do. And after Mass, I went to Dublin and flew out to Paris with my friend. And I passed a newsstand, which is in the centre of Paris. And it was full of newspapers from all over the world. And every single paper there had a photograph of the Pope with a large negative, no, 9, and so on. And I quickly realized that the Pope had made a statement reaffirming the traditional view on contraception. And we looked at them in some disbelief, and we figured the game was up.
I think we'll have to question why the church is so against women asserting their own sexuality and having a choice over it and expressing that. And I suspect that one of the main reasons for that is fear. And that fear, I think, is borne out through the whole notion of virgin and the whore. And given that it's men who are controlling the church and men who have the power in the church, I think that there's a great fear around female sexuality and what will happen if women start expressing themselves.
Male power, church power and political power often reinforce each other. The Reverend Martin Smith, a Church of Ireland minister, is spokesman for health for the official Unionist Party, the North's largest political party, and a major supporter of Life, the anti-abortion group. He is also a member of the British Parliament and Grand Master of the Orange Order of Ireland.
We repeat our plea of many years for stronger security actions to be taken against the terrorists who must be beaten militarily.
The Free Presbyterian Church has as its moderator the Reverend Ian Paisley, who is also the head of the Democratic Unionist Party, the North's second largest political party. He is a member of both the British Parliament and the European Parliament.
Because the Church of Rome is out to destroy Protestantism in this Emerald Isle.
The Catholic Church, on the other hand, disapproves of its clerics holding public office, yet they avail of their easy access to the media to explain their position on the moral and political questions of the day.
Well, I found at that time that a lot of ordinary people, Catholics in North Belfast, had a lot of resentment towards the Catholic bishop, who hadn't been seen in the area for quite some time, and who then made an appearance at Cahal funeral. I wasn't aware that he was coming, and the statement that he made at that time was not appreciated by the vast number of working class Catholics that I knew. The statement was an attack on the IRA and paramilitary violence, but a lot of people I know would have left and walked out of the church, only they were there as a respect to our family, and the Mass, the funeral service and what Daly said were irrelevant to them. Daly was equating a whole number of issues as being one thing, and it was against God's law, and that isn't the way that people look at it. He was out of touch, to be quite honest. He was completely out of touch.
Not only was Bishop Daly apparently out of touch, but much of the media espouses a Christian ethos and projects it onto others regardless of their beliefs. The existence of atheism is denied by being ignored.
We put out a press statement saying that we didn't want any retaliation and that it was a useless waste of a life. The press picked up on that, and one of the local newspapers then carried that as the essential Christianity of the McLaughlin family. That wasn't what it was about. It wasn't about high moral tones or anything like that. It was just that we didn't see any point in somebody else losing their life because our column had been killed in that way. The Christianity thing was just so irrelevant for us. It was a political issue. It wasn't a religious issue or a moral issue. It was politics. I don't support violence here because I don't think it works. It's not because people die or whatever. It just doesn't work. It hasn't changed things, hasn't affected the lives of ordinary people.
Although Irish people are perceived as having strong religious affiliations, the percentage of the population who could be described as practicing Christians is probably in the minority. A survey carried out in Belfast in 1988 revealed that 57% of Catholics and 90% of Protestants do not attend church regularly. Those who do reject the basis of Christianity have to construct an alternative morality for themselves.
I think that in a Christian society, atheists are very much defined in terms of what we are not. You know, we're seen as being people who go around murdering babies and breaking up families, you know. And in fact, I think that atheists can be much more morally scrupulous than a lot of Christians because we have to make our own moral decisions. There is nobody to tell us what we should think about a particular issue.
My mother, who would be a deeply religious Catholic in that sense, and turned to the church and found great solace in the church and so on. I'm an atheist, as Colin was, and that was of no benefit and no help to me. It was the spiritualist way. So for me, the easy way out was the comrades, the friends that I'd built up down through the years. I found of immense help as a support network, I suppose.
Since I had the abortion, I have since had 2 children. And I have, you know, it has further confirmed, if you like, that it was the right decision. Immediately once I became pregnant with my eldest daughter, it just felt right. I had a totally different sensation. I just felt, I knew instinctively I could cope no matter what happened. Whereas I had no sense of that with the previous pregnancy. And I feel that I am a better mother now to the 2 children that I have for the decision that I took 10 years ago.
All parents who want to who believe they have a right to rear their child without religion and who want to do it, come up against this problem at primary school level. Where do you send your child? You've got the state system or the private system. That's mostly Catholic, but there are also Protestant primary schools as well. The state system tends to be Protestant dominated. So we were faced with that problem of the children. And luckily, I suppose, for us, there was a school where there had been a population movement. It was about 50-50 between Catholics and Protestants and various other people as well. So that was ideal for our purposes. But we can sympathise with parents who are left with a very straight choice. Either send your child to a Catholic school or, when it comes to the crunch, a Protestant school. And the only thing you can do in a case like that is to be very firm with the staff and teachers and be quite clear about the philosophy or outlook of your children and be prepared to protect them.
It always seemed to me that if you're a practicing Christian, you really have no privacy because, you know, as children we learned these little songs which instructed you that God was always near you and that everything you said or did or even thought he was aware of, you know, and I find that a terrible intrusion upon my privacy, you know, it's having this God who's snooping into everything, you know. It really wouldn't appeal to me.